A very good evening and welcome to The Bottom Line, a wrap of some of your top business news stories of the day. My name is Kunta and we begin as usual with your number of the day. Today, that number is 1.2%. That, according to the Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Committee, is a forecast of GDP growth for South Africa for 2020. That's decreased from previously projected figures of 1.4%. Next year's growth is forecast at 1.6%. So those numbers seem anemic, but they're also very optimistic given the 0.9% forecast by the IMF and the World Bank. South Africa is battling not only low growth, but seemingly a dearth of ideas on which solution will work best and now. So I'm joined in studio by Mandla Isaacs. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. Why are we here?
Thanks for having me, Nzinga. Well, I think we're all aware of the past decade, which even our president has called a lost decade. I think the mistakes that we've had have been compounded by just a complete lack of vision. If you think back to 2012, when the National Development Plan was announced, it basically said for the next 2 decades to 2030, we need to average 5 to 6% growth to make a meaningful dent in poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And essentially over the past decade, growth has basically been flat and has barely kept up with population growth. So essentially we've stood still and in fact you could argue have slid backwards. So essentially that's why we're here. We've lacked a vision, we've scored a lot of own goals, whereas the world economy is quite dynamic and has moved around us and left us behind.
So practically, what are the consequences of low growth for South Africa?
So think about what happens in a fast-growing economy, right? For individuals, their job opportunities are great. There's lots of businesses that are hiring. Remember, businesses hire when they're investing to take advantage of growth. So they're adding factories, they're adding sites because there are more customers out there and there's more business that they're trying to capture. And as a result, they hire. So people are able to, have different job opportunities to get more wages. Businesses have to increase wages to keep their staff. Companies are growing and thriving because there's more customers and the economy is expanding. Fixed investment leads to construction, growth, exports increase. All of those things are great for businesses, great for individuals. Tax revenue increases. You remember with all the social needs that we have, education, health, all of that requires revenue, whether it's more police on the streets. All of that money has to come from somewhere, and generally that has to come from tax revenue. When your economy is growing, then your economy is basically paying for those government services. In our case, our economy is not growing, and we essentially have to borrow to pay for those services. So, the consequence of low growth is essentially less opportunities for individuals, rising unemployment as more people enter the labor pool every year than jobs are created. And, unfortunately, businesses are pessimistic because there aren't customers for them to chase. And so everyone is just kind of managing decline.
So you've spoken about the NDP, that dream of 5% growth. Obviously, we're nowhere near that. There was also Finance Minister Tito Mbowene's suggestion of a new economic plan. What's the issue with that, and why is there not implementation practically? So,
look, I think it's important to think about the plan that he's released are, quite frankly, common sense reforms, right? I mean, network industries, he talks about modernizing our approach to energy and transportation. Really, if you think about for the past decade, with the power crisis that we started in 2008, electricity availability has basically capped our economic growth potential at roughly 2%. So we've talked about the need to modernize things like that. The Treasury has modeled that if we were to implement the reforms in this plan, which quite frankly we have not shown our ability to do, it would get us close to maybe 3% over a decade. So that plan I would have you think of as it would get us walking forward, which is clearly important, but it wouldn't even get us running the way we would need to emulate the kind of growth that the Asian tigers did over the past generation.
You would have insight into issues around the economy and growth. Besides the corporate places you've worked, you've also been at Treasury.
Yes.
What's the problem? Should we be blaming you in part?
So in part, sure. I mean, I think everyone in government has to take responsibility. I think the difficulty that we've had, I'll say 2 things. Number one is that if you remember, Jacob Zuma former President Zuma created the Department of Economic Development to take over economic policy planning from Treasury. Trade and Industry Minister Patel was quite energetic in that regard. And economic policy kind of fragmented, quite frankly. We didn't have a clear vision on economic policy, I think, over the past decade. I think Treasury has started to reassert its role. and has put out this plan. Unfortunately, a lot of the interventions in the plan have to be delivered by other departments. So, for example, mining, the Department of Mining is responsible for clarifying mining policy, which has held us back. Telecommunications is responsible for clarifying the auctioning of spectrum. And of course, we know that energy policy, which is a big deal, things like bringing in more independent power producers, things like allowing firms and residents to generate their own electricity and even feed it into the grid, which is one of the proposals by National Treasury. That's going to be decided by the Department of Energy and to a lesser extent DPE with the governance of ESCOM.
So you've written this article in the Daily Maverick about the two opposing worldviews of why South Africa is not growing and cannot grow. It's almost echoing former President Thabo Mbeki's analysis or assessment of South Africa as two nations. Take me through that.
So, as we sit here and wonder, why can we not get this economy moving, right? I mean, it's not as if the decision makers and policymakers do not know what to do. Many of these proposals have been out there even before the Treasury document. So you have to think back to some of the deeper lying issues about why we're not seeing movement. Why have we not been able to conclude a mining policy for 10 years? And the reality is that when the politicians are thinking about policy and trying to choose a direction, they have different constituencies that they have to manage. So while, the big listed companies that are represented by, BLSA and BUSA are saying, look, you need to push through these common sense reforms. On the other side, politicians have to listen to black business people, black entrepreneurs who are saying, you can't just create business-friendly policies or policies that are friendly to established business. What about us? So, for example, in mining, the question is, do you just make it easy for foreign direct investment to come in and, sink money into mines, and when those mines come to fruition, repatriate that capital? Or do you insist that these corporates have to take on local partners? What are the terms of that? What does the local partner have to contribute? There was this free carry provision that was in the last version that ultimately, the mining council was very negative towards. So those are the kind of back and forth that have led to us stalling on these key policy areas because we've been unable to find a policy direction that is acceptable to all of the key constituencies.
Mandla Isaacs, a political economist and managing director at Zehuti Advisory, joining me in studio there. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News this evening.
Thank you.